Hey, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. I was recently flipping through this book that I have. It's sort of rare and probably hard to find at this point. I've had it for over 20 years. It's called Artists on Comic Art by Mark Salisbury. I mentioned it in a really old video that I made a while ago, but in flipping through it, it's really cool to see the artists in here that are featured and the process behind their work. There's everything from pencil sketches to character designs to penciled pages, all the way they go about making comics. But in this video, I wanted to talk about two of the artists that are in here and their very different approaches to making a comic book page. Those two artists are Jim Lee and J. Scott Campbell. I'm a child of the 90s myself, so those were like two superstar artists when I was growing up and collecting comics, and they also were two of my favorites growing up. They also happen to have a close artistic history together. Jim Lee discovered J. Scott Campbell and sort of brought him under his wing for the early part of Campbell's career. So there is definitely an overlap stylistically. I single these two out because, according to this book, their approaches are very, very opposite. And it sort of highlights the fact that there is no one way to go about approaching a comic book page, from laying it out to penciling it to inking it. And in this video, we're really just going to be talking about the laying out and the penciling part. Some of you are aspiring artists yourself. Some of you are professional artists. I think both of us can really get something out of seeing different approaches to making the same thing. And if you're brand new to making comics, perhaps this video might give you an idea about how a comic book artist even goes about starting a page to begin with. This book is almost 25 years old at this point, so perhaps both of these artists have tweaked their approach since then, but it's just a good example of how, at least at one point, they were creating comic pages. Because this is more of a rare book, this was an import when I got it, it's likely that you have never really seen the images in this book. And if you're a fan of Jim Lee or J. Scott Campbell, perhaps this is stuff that you might not have seen. Anyway, let's crack it open and see how these two artists approach drawing a comic page in two very different ways. Okay, so here is the book, Artists on Comic Art. I'm going to flip right to the J. Scott Campbell section. He was one of my favorite artists at the time, so you can see it just opens very naturally to his section over here. This book is well worn and well used. Perhaps in a future video, we could go a little bit more into depth on some of the parts of this chapter that are really cool to look at. But for this particular video, I just wanted to talk about his approach to how he creates a page. I was reminded of his process because recently on Instagram, there was a video of him actually talking about this very process. And I think he was using these exact 4 pages as an example. I thought that was pretty cool because when I had this book as a much younger person, I would really study his process, and I was very much fascinated by how he was able to get so much detail on such small drawings. So the way he would go about laying out and penciling his pages, at least during this Danger Girl era, this was more in the late 90s, early 2000s, was that he would take a full sheet of 11 by 17 Bristol board paper. So 11 by 17 is really the standard size for American comics to be drawn at full size. That's the size that, before it gets shrunk down to the size that you're used to seeing in the comic book store, 11 by 17 is the full size that the artist would generally draw their original pages on. So what this shows is a full 11 by 17 page that normally an artist would draw 1 page on. What he would do is he would divide it into 4 equal parts, each part representing its own page. So an 11 by 17 sheet of paper is a bigger sized sheet of paper, but when you divide it into 4 parts, now all of a sudden you're not working with the biggest amount of space. So each one of these pages was really drawn pretty small. And it's fascinating to see just how much detail and how much characterization and all the composition of the page was really all there at that very, very small size. Okay, really quick, just for context, this is an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. So this is what J. Scott Campbell was dividing into 4 pages. So just to give you a little bit of a context in terms of the size that he was working at, each one of the 4 pages that he was working on was actually pretty small, much smaller than an individual comic size itself. And he was able to get that level of detail. It's pretty cool. That's something that I was very fascinated by back then when I was trying to understand his process, and I still am today. I don't think I could get that level of detail or even be able to see that much of the compositions and kind of flesh them out at this size. You could also see it's pretty cool that he's indicating where the words are going to go. He was co-writing this series, so he was, I guess, working out some of the dialogue and narration and all of that, while also accounting for the space that the words were going to go in, which is a really important part of the compositional process of creating a comic page, because of course, if there's going to be words, the word bubbles and the narration boxes are just as important a part of the composition as the characters and the backgrounds and everything else. From what he states in this article here, what he would do is he would work out the pages in this way, 4 to a sheet. And then when he got it to a level, I guess a level like this, that was clear enough for him to then work off of, he would blow up each one of these images full size onto an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. He would blow it up full size like this and lightbox it and work on it more detailed at this full size. And then presumably render on top of that and make it a finished penciled page before he sent it off to his inker. This particular Danger Girl series really felt in many ways like a Hollywood movie blockbuster in terms of its presentation, its pacing, its attention to detail. So like a Hollywood blockbuster, a lot would go into the making of these things. A lot of time, a lot of specific attention to detail, and perhaps even less spontaneity, as the artist was going for something very much controlled and specific to his vision. Because of that, it seems like this approach and this process really, really worked for him and the style and the type of comic that he was making at the time. Now, you might ask why he would draw it so small to begin with in the first place. I think that's a matter of taste. Every artist has their own particular approach and the way they feel comfortable creating things. Some artists feel comfortable drawing much smaller at first. Some artists feel comfortable drawing at full size, as we'll see in a little bit. But I think one of the benefits to drawing something so small at first is that your eye is able to sort of capture the whole thing in a thumbnail size. And a lot of comic book artists will do tiny thumbnails, certainly most of them not at this level of detail, but even something that's a little bit more rough and even sometimes stick figures. Essentially what you want to see is the skeleton of the page, the bare bones of the page, the basic storytelling from panel to panel. The idea is that if it can work at this very small size and make sense visually, then once you blow it up to the printed size or the size that you're eventually going to draw it at, it will all make sense and be clear to the reader. That's the basic idea behind working small. And then it seems like in his case, I would assume that he has an inclination to draw smaller because he feels just more comfortable drawing smaller. I think it's just different for every artist. And that's probably why these pages were drawn with so much detail at this very small size. Compositionally, if he's able to lay these things out and make sense of them at this size, then once he blows it up, all the compositions are worked out, and then he just has more room essentially to do all the detail, rendering, and all that cool stuff. I think also doing it this way, he's able to look at each page as it is part of a spread. That's also really helpful from a storytelling perspective because he's seeing what pages face each other and how the story might flow not only just as individual pages, but as pages that are going to eventually be next to each other. Comics are this sort of like Russian doll of compositions. It's not only the composition of each individual panel, but then it's the composition of each page, but then it's the composition of each spread, and then it's the composition of the whole book as it flows from page to page. So to be able to kind of get a handle on that from a macro perspective this way, I think is probably very helpful. Is it a little bit of overkill because these are essentially just thumbnail sketches? From my perspective, I would probably say yes, but that's just my sensibilities. Different strokes for different folks. Now, when we fast forward to the Jim Lee section here, we'll see a very, very different approach. So Jim Lee's approach would be that he would just draw right onto the full 11 by 17 artboard. He would start with real roughs, very, very loose, almost stick figure-esque, but he was doing it at full size instead of doing it at like a little tiny thumbnail size first. So this was right onto the 11 by 17 drawing board. And according to his Twitch streams in recent years, it seems like he still works this way. Some of his Twitch streams, he'll draw a page from start to finish. It'll be like a 8-9 hour stream. They're pretty interesting to watch. A lot of them are reposted on YouTube. But it seems as though he still works this very way. He'll just go right onto the drawing board and start working out the page. He uses a very fat, blunt, mechanical pencil and just kind of works it out with big shapes and big pencil strokes. And you can see here that he's even just stating with words what is happening in each panel. I would assume because this was back when he was working on X-Men, that this was just to clarify things because he was probably sending this off to an editor first just to get approval, and then he would go on to more detailed pencils. Speaking of more detailed pencils, this would then become the penciled page that this really rough drawing started off as. So it's really cool to see the side by side. Obviously, all the bare bones and, like I said, the skeleton of the page is there. And then he would just really render on top of it, pretty insanely render it until it became, a classic Jim Lee page. We could get a little closer look at some of the comparison here. I'll try to do some handy camera work so that you can see some of the comparison from sketch to final here. Pretty cool. Here's another example of Jim Lee's approach. This is the rough of a particular X-Men page, and I would imagine that he would lay out a whole issue just like this and send it off to the editor so that the editor could just make sure that things are reading clearly, all the storytelling is there. He can see where there's going to be a big panel with a lot of characters in it, and then where there's going to be close-ups and all that kind of stuff. You can see here that Jim Lee wasn't spending a lot of time at all on the detail. He was probably spending more of that time just working out all the storytelling things. So in contrast to J. Scott Campbell's approach, this is the complete opposite. He's working full size and he's doing it really rough. And then from here, these are the finished inks for that page. So this page was not only penciled, but then inked by presumably Scott Williams. And you can see where this was just set up in essentially like stick figure form. But you can see the bishop close-up right there. And it's kind of cool to see how the page really started and then finished. Now, what might be the benefit to Jim Lee's approach here? Well, I think that when you work this way, Jim Lee's way, where you're going right onto the board, there's a certain level of spontaneity that is more likely to happen with your approach. You're working a little bit faster and perhaps This works better for trying to stay on a tighter deadline. I think when he was on X-Men, these books were really coming out on time once a month, and he wouldn't have had as much time to kind of noodle at that very, very small size for a while before then blowing it up and then lightboxing it and essentially drawing it twice. The way I was saying before, where the Danger Girl book was much more of like a, high budget Hollywood blockbuster, perhaps this version of a comic book approach was more like a daily soap opera. Both are professionally filmed, professionally executed productions, but one has to come out much more regularly and is working with a smaller time frame and perhaps a smaller budget. And then the other one has a year or 2 years, including pre-production and all that kind of stuff. So if I had to make that comparison, that's kind of how I would compare these two different approaches. But like I said earlier, I think it also just has to do with the particular taste and sensibilities of those artists themselves. The more you do anything, whether it's making comics or painting oil paintings, the more you kind of start to understand your own process and what works and what doesn't work and what provides you with the best results. And it seems like the both of them, J. Scott Campbell and Jim Lee, sort of found the process that works for them and keeps the final product consistent for them. From what I read, and it might have been in this very book actually, J. Scott Campbell, when he was first starting to draw comics professionally with Image Comics, I think for that first Gen 13 miniseries, it was like a 3 or 4 part miniseries, Jim Lee was actually drawing the layouts for him. So he would work on top of a full-size layout drawn by Jim Lee, and then render and finish it with his own pencils on top of Jim Lee's rough. He stated that that was a really good way for him to kind of learn storytelling and learn how to make comics. But then as time went on, understandably so, he kind of felt like he was a little bit in a box because he was always working off of Jim Lee's roughs rather than kind of visualizing the page the way he normally would. I think when you're first starting out, though, that's a really great way to understand how to make comics, how to lay out a page, and it kind of takes a lot of the thinking out of it so that you can focus more on the drawing part. Some of the first interior comic work that I did was actually done in that same way. I worked with another artist, and he laid out both issues that I worked on, and then I just worked on top of his layouts. We were working at a very fast pace to try to get 2 issues done in a very short amount of time. So that actually helped from a time frame perspective. But it also helped me in terms of just getting comfortable drawing comics without having to worry about the storytelling stuff and laying out a page, which again really is the most important part of the process. As much as this might look like just stick figures and rough little doodles, this is really the important part of the comic making process. Because without this, the foundation underneath, you can't have something fully realized like this. So there's more than one way to do anything, and that is no exception when it comes to drawing comics. I hope this was a fun little look at some J. Scott Campbell and Jim Lee preliminary pencil work that perhaps you might not have seen before. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video and the look at this Artists on Comic Art book. This is one of my treasures. It was just a rare book that I bought at the time. This was imported from the UK. It's got the pound symbol on the back. But it's a really great resource for understanding the way different artists, especially of this time and era, were going about making their comic book pages. None of these artists were digital at the time, except I think for Brian Bolland. But the vast majority of them were all working traditionally, so it's really cool to see how they were using traditional tools to create some of the most popular comics of the time. This might still be available somewhere online. I'll try to see if I can find a link to it and maybe put it in the description below. But if you'd like to see me go through some of the other artist process in this book in a future video, there's a lot of really great stuff in here, like I said. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see a little bit of a closer look at the contents of this book. That's it for now. Thanks so much for watching. This was really fun to look through with all of you. If you like this video, please do hit that like button. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing to my channel. And until next time, take care.